finally finished reading Leviticus. And the whole time I was reading it, I kept thinking to myself that all these rules seem really strict and God seems really harsh. And there are a few reasons that I can come up with as to why that might be. The first is that we have the benefit in 2025 to be able to read the Bible and learn everything about God. We get to know what he wants us to know, and we have like this rule book of how to live life. But back during the time of Moses, who wrote a large swath of the Old Testament, they didn't have a Bible. So God had to implement these really strict rules to get his point across. I mean, at the time, societies, I mean, just like they are today, but large societies, entire towns and cities were living completely against his word. So, it's like he had to get his point across. And, we're stubborn beings, us humans. I'm about as stubborn as they come. Anybody that knows me knows that. But, that to me is like the why, right? Like if there's a point where it talks about two guys that were in a fight and one of them blasphemed God during the fight. And basically Noah decided after pondering about it and God telling him that he needs to be stoned to death. It's like, man, that's extreme, right? But there's a couple of things that go into that. One is, again, God had to make his point. And for you and I, that's really hard to justify in our hearts. But we have to keep in mind that at this time, heaven and hell didn't exist in the way that they do now. It was a different place. It was called Hades and paradise. And this was basically the way I'm viewing it, and I could be wrong, but the way I've perceived it so far, my understanding, is that it's almost like a holding cell waiting for Judgment Day. And Judgment Day is basically when Jesus comes around, right? Jesus always existed, but when Jesus comes around for the Judgment Day. And I think it also makes sense, and it's consistent with God being fair and just. Because if God is choosing to remove someone's life when they don't have him in their heart, then God is in fact damning them, right? But I think that in these instances where God is actually going, interceding on earth and taking people's lives, he is not damning them to hell. He might be sending them to paradise. He might be sending them to Hades. But I think in those places, people get to continue to reach salvation. This is all speculative. I don't know it to be fact, but it's kind of my perception from what I've read so far. So that's kind of a little bit of a scapegoat for God. Not that he needs it, but that's the best I can come up with for the harshness of some of these penalties. Another thing too is just understanding that when reading these rules, this is all before Jesus comes down to earth to give us our salvation. God is, and I was thinking a lot about this morning, but we are basically three parts the same way God is, right? God is God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We as humans, we are our minds, we are our hearts and bodies, and we are our spirits. The way that I'm kind of perceiving this right now is that God is kind of like our minds. God is consistent. He's analytical. I hate to use this term because I think it might be like almost blasphemous, but I'm going to use it as a descriptor, but almost like sociopathic in the sense that like God has to be constant. His word has to be final, because if he deviates for one person or another, then he wouldn't be God, right? He has to be perfect from beginning to end. God is outside of time. And so God to me is kind of like the mind of the Trinity, right? He's almost pure analytical based off of the rules that he gave us to live. Where Jesus is the heart, is the body. Jesus is the feeling, the emotion. Jesus is the one that cries out for us and hurts for us and aches for us. Jesus is the one that sacrificed himself so that we could live, because God, the mind, says, hey, the rules are, if you sin, it needs to be paid for by blood. Sin equals death. So God says, if you sin, you have to die. And Jesus says, hey, that's true, but I'm going to die for you, right? And so that leaves the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one that comes inside of us and that fills us. The Spirit is who we are. And so I was explaining this to my kids, right? It's kind of like, I told my son, I said, hey, you are who you are, right? My son's name is Levi. I said, you're Levi, right? And he goes, yeah, of course. And I said, hey, if I like chopped off your left hand, would you be any less Levi? And he goes, no, I'd still be Levi. I said, well, what if you lost both of your arms and both of your legs? Would you still be Levi? And he said, well, yeah, of course. And I said, okay, well, so when we die and your body stays on earth, but your spirit, your soul goes to heaven, are you still Levi? And he goes, yeah, absolutely. And I said, okay, well, that's how kind of like what God is. God is spirit, right? God is body. He is mind, just like us, and how we make our decisions and we analyze things, we think about things and make decisions. That is part of who we are, but it isn't us as an entire essence. We also have our spirit, right? God is our mind, Jesus is our body, and then he's also our spirit, which is who we are. So I think about, at least when I was reading through this today, that's kind of how I thought about God and the Trinity, and how all that works from like an analytical standpoint. I don't know if it's accurate, but it does help me understand some of the harshness of God's reactions to sin, because again, he has to stay consistent because he is perfect. So those are my thoughts for today. I think I'm going to read through Numbers. I wanted to get to New Testament because some of the stuff's a little hard and it's heavy, but I really want to have a full picture of the Old Testament before I go to the New Testament. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the Old Testament. I'm actually increasing the amount I'm reading every day. One, because it's getting a little bit easier for me to read this stuff. Anybody that knows me knows I'm not a big reader, so just even reading in general has been a difficult start for me. But as I'm leaning into it more, I'm actually enjoying it, and it's, as I have more context for some of this stuff, I feel like I'm grasping a little bit better. So if you're reading along with me, I'm about to go into Numbers, and I'm really interested to see if you have any thoughts on anything I said in this video. Again, I may not have used the right words, and I may have concepts completely wrong. And as I continue to study and read the Bible, maybe I'll have a better understanding. But again, as I was reading through today and putting it in context of everything I've read thus far, and just what I've learned from church and watching other much smarter people than me talk about this stuff, that's kind of the theory I came up with. So that's all for now. I hope you guys have an awesome one.